The cruelest silences are not the ones we choose. They are the ones grief chooses for us, and they settle into a child like frost into stone, patient, invisible, and very nearly permanent. Miss Ashby. The housekeeper's voice cut through the scullery doorway with the clean efficiency of a blade. Lady Fortin requires the household accounts presented before luncheon, all of them. She has a buyer interested in the eastern parcels and intends to show him the estate is solvent. Wren did not look up from the ledger she was already holding. She did not ask what Lady Fortin intended to show a buyer she had not been informed of. She set the page flat on the deal table, smoothed a crease with 2 fingers, and said, "Tell her ladyship the accounts will be on her escritoire within the hour." Mrs. Price lingered a breath too long in the doorway. A woman who had learned to read catastrophe in the slope of Wren's shoulders and had apparently found something there to worry about. But she went. She always went, in the end. That was the economy of Fortin House. Everyone went when dismissed, and no one asked the question they most wanted to ask. Wren was 24. She had been keeping Fortin House's books for 14 months, having arrived with 2 dresses, a carpet bag, and a reference letter from a Bristol solicitor who had described her, with evident surprise, as possessing an unusual facility for numeration. What the letter had not described, because solicitors do not trade in such things, was that she had learned those numbers at her father's knee, in his quiet study in Wells, watching him balance the accounts of a wool merchant's small empire with the same careful reverence another man might give to scripture. Her father had been dead for 2 years. The wool merchant's empire had died with him, absorbed by debt she had not been permitted to know about until the solicitors arrived. She had not wept when they came. She had offered them tea and asked for an itemized accounting of what was owed. It had shocked them considerably. The ledger under her hands now told a different kind of story. Fortin House was not solvent. It had not been solvent for some time. Lady Fortin's late husband had borrowed against the eastern parcels 3 times in the last decade, and 2 of those loans were still outstanding. The figure Wren had arrived at, working backward through 6 years of disordered receipts and conflated household expenses, was £4,812 in unsecured debt. She had written it in her clearest hand at the bottom of the summary page, and had been waiting, with something approaching dread, for the right moment to present it. That moment had apparently arrived uninvited, in the form of a buyer Lady Fortin had not troubled to mention. She gathered the pages, aligned them, bound them with the thin cord kept in the tin box on the shelf, and walked the corridor to the front of the house. The entrance hall was already busy, not with the ordinary busyness of a country estate preparing for guests, but with the particular, bristling energy of a household caught between performance and panic. A footman was polishing a mirror that had been polished yesterday. One of the parlor maids had been tasked with cutting early garden blooms and was depositing them in a vase with trembling speed. Lady Fortin herself stood at the foot of the staircase in a morning dress of pale blue silk that Wren recognized as last season's but recently retrimmed. She was speaking to someone Wren could not yet see, and then she could see him. The man standing in the entrance hall of Fortin House was tall in a way that reorganized the room around him. Not theatrical tallness. He did not stoop or angle himself to accommodate it. He simply occupied his height with the absolute ease of a man who has never once considered whether he fit the space he was standing in. He was dressed plainly for a man of obvious consequence. Dark coat, no ornament, the white at his cravat precise. His hair was dark brown, almost black in the dimness of the hall, and his face was the kind of face you noticed not for prettiness, but for stillness. A jaw that held tension without expressing it. Eyes the color of pewter in winter light, moving across the hall with a slow, surveying quality, as though he were reading something written on the air. He was Lord Lucian Ashworth, the Duke of Caldervane. Wren did not know this yet. She knew only that every person in the entrance hall had subtly repositioned themselves in relation to him, and that Lady Fortin was smiling with the specific warmth she reserved for people whose good opinion she required urgently. "Miss Ashby," Lady Fortin said, catching sight of her with a tightening of the smile that meant her presence was inconvenient. "You may leave the accounts on the table." "Your ladyship asked for them presented before luncheon," Wren said, not a reminder. A plain repetition of fact, offered quietly. Something shifted in the hall. The footman with the mirror cloth went very still. Lady Fortin's smile did not waver. but something behind it did. The man, the Duke, though Wren did not know it yet, turned his head. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has surprised him against his will, just for a moment. Then he looked back at Lady Fortin. "We can review the estate figures after luncheon," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. It did not request, it organized. Lady Fortin exhaled. "Of course, Miss Ashby, that will be all for now." Wren set the ledger on the side table as directed. She walked back down the corridor and did not allow herself to look at him again. She noted the signet ring on his right hand, the particular quality of stillness around him that suggested authority so settled it required no performance, and the way none of the servants had breathed naturally since he stepped through the door. She filed these observations away in the methodical habit she had developed over 14 months of surviving a household that told her very little directly. She did not know that the man had purchased Fortin House's outstanding debt from 2 separate banking houses the previous Thursday. She did not know that he had ridden out this morning with his solicitor's summary in his breast pocket and Fortin House's complete financial ruin mapped to the penny. She did not know any of it, but she had been keeping accounts long enough to recognize, in the particular stillness of a man who already held all the relevant numbers, the quiet of a person who already knew the answer before the question was asked. She knew what that felt like. She had learned it from her father. She was still thinking about it when the door to the schoolroom at the end of the east corridor opened, and a small, thin boy looked out at her. He was perhaps 7 years old, fair-haired, pale in the way children go pale when they have been indoors too long. He was wearing clothes of excellent quality and 2 new boots that had not yet scuffed enough to look worn in. He looked at Wren with gray eyes, very much the same gray as the man in the hall, and did not speak. Wren stopped walking. She did not introduce herself. Children who had been silent a long time did not always benefit from the pressure of an adult who rushed to fill the space. She simply stood in the corridor for a moment, and then she said, "The accounts were dull today. They are sometimes interesting, but today they were not." The boy continued to look at her. "The interesting days," she said, "are when the numbers don't match where they're supposed to be, and you have to find out why. It's like a puzzle. Today there was no puzzle, just long columns that agreed with each other." She paused. "That is the boring kind of day." The boy said nothing, but he did not close the door. Wren left him there and went back to the scullery. She did not learn his name until supper time. The household had organized luncheon with visible desperation and considerable cold salmon. Wren ate in the servants' hall, as she always did, occupying the seat nearest the window where the light was best for reading, and listened to the kitchen maid tell the footman that the guest was a duke, the Duke of Caldervane, and that he had come not for a social call but on business, and that Mrs. Price had been summoned to the front parlor for 20 minutes, and had come back out looking as though she had been told something she needed time to process. "Business," the footman said, with the tone of someone who understood that word to have implications. "His solicitor is with him," the kitchen maid said, "Mr. Ellison, and Mr. Ellison has a case full of papers." Wren ate her bread and said nothing. At 3:30, Mrs. Price appeared in the doorway of the room, where Wren was resorting the quarterly receipts into the correct year, a task she had been putting off because Lady Fortin's filing system appeared to have been organized by a person suffering from a profound disinterest in chronology, and said, "His Grace will see you." Wren set down the receipt she was holding. His Grace? The Duke of Caldervane. Mrs. Price's expression was the one she wore when she had decided that sympathy was not a useful thing to offer. "In the front parlor now, if you please." The front parlor of Fortin House was a room that tried too hard. There were too many china figures on the mantelpiece, too many competing patterns in the upholstery, and a portrait of Lady Fortin's late husband on the wall that Wren had always found slightly accusing in its angle. The Duke sat in the wing chair nearest the window. Not by accident, she noted. The light behind him put his face in partial shadow, and anyone seated opposite in full clarity. A solicitor she did not recognize sat at the side table with papers open in front of him. Lady Fortin was not in the room. The absence of Lady Fortin was more informative than her presence would have been. The Duke looked at Wren when she entered. He looked at her for a measured moment with those winter pewter eyes, and then said, "You presented the accounts this morning." "Lady Fortin asked for them presented before luncheon," Wren said. Yes. You prepared them. I have been keeping Fortin House's accounts for 14 months. Sit down. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap and did not look at the solicitor's papers, though she wanted to. The accounts you prepared, the Duke said. The summary figure at the bottom of the final page. £4,812, Wren said. Outstanding and unsecured debt across 2 banking instruments and 1 private loan from 1818. The private loan is the most complicated because the documentation is incomplete on the lender's side, and there may be additional interest that was never formalized in writing. A silence. The solicitor made a note. Are you telling me, the Duke said, that you identified a discrepancy in the private loan documentation without having access to the lender's original terms? I am telling you that the figures on Fortin House's side of the record do not correspond to any standard interest schedule I recognize, which suggests either a non-standard arrangement or that someone made a copying error at some point and it was never caught. She paused. I flagged it in the margin. It should be the 3rd page in. The solicitor turned to the 3rd page and made another note. He glanced at the Duke. Something passed between them that Wren could not read, but the solicitor's expression suggested he had not expected to be making this particular note. How long have you worked with accounts? The Duke said. Since I was 9 years old. She met his eyes steadily. My father kept the books of a wool merchant's operation in Wells. He taught me his method. I was more interested than he had expected. Your father. He died 2 years ago. She said it without inflection. Not because she felt none. She was aware of the particular weight that sentence still carried in her chest, the way it had never quite settled into something she could put down, but because this was not the place for it, and she had learned, in the 14 months since Bristol, that grief expressed in front of people who had not asked for it was simply a different kind of vulnerability. The business was dissolved. I took a position. The Duke looked at her for a moment. She could not tell what he was looking for. His face was not unkind, but it was withheld in the way of a man who had decided long ago that expression was a resource to be allocated carefully. I have purchased the outstanding debt on this estate, he said, as of last Thursday. Wren absorbed this. She did not look away from him. All of it? All of it. Including the private loan. Including the private loan. He paused. Lady Fortin is aware. She has been made an offer for the eastern parcels that will discharge the majority of the obligation. She has accepted it. So the estate was not ruined. It was merely diminished. Wren had seen this pattern before, in Bristol, the late rush of a sale that saves the shell of a thing by surrendering its best parts. She said, that is fortunate for her. Perhaps. The Duke's gaze was on her face, with an attention she was finding difficult to categorize. The position you hold here. It will not survive a sale, Wren said. I am aware of that. Lady Fortin has indicated that the arrangement for in-house accounting will change as the estate contracts. Yes. She did not look down. She kept her hands still in her lap. I expected as much. I have a household, the Duke said, Caldervane, in Northumberland. It requires a competent administrator for its accounts. The current arrangement is insufficient. He stopped. He appeared to choose his next word with care. The position is a formal one. A salary of £80 per annum, independent rooms in the family wing, rather than the servants' quarters, and full authority over the estate's financial records within the limits I specify. £80. She did not let herself react to the number visibly. It was more than twice what she earned at Fortin House. It was enough, more than enough, to begin to feel like something other than survival. Why me? She said. Because you found the error in the private loan documentation in 14 months, without the lender's original terms, he said. And because you did not hesitate when Lady Fortin tried to redirect you this morning. He paused. I noticed things like that. She looked at him. He looked back. She said, You have a child. It was not a question. She had seen the boy in the doorway, and the boy had his eyes, and a child in 2 new boots in the east corridor of a country house being visited by a Duke was not a difficult riddle to solve. Something moved across the Duke's face. Not pain, exactly. Something older than pain. My son, he said. Edmund, he is 7. He was in the east corridor this afternoon. He came to the schoolroom door. The Duke's expression sharpened. He came out. He opened the door, Wren said. He didn't speak, but he looked at me for some time before he went back in. The solicitor had stopped writing. The room had gone very quiet. Edmund has not spoken to a stranger, the Duke said slowly. In 2 years. Wren considered this. She thought of the boy's eyes, the same gray as his father's, but without the discipline, without the containment. She thought of what he had looked like standing in the doorway, watchful and cautious and intensely, carefully curious, the way a child looks when it wants something very much, but has learned to be afraid of wanting. She understood that look. She had worn it, at least internally, for the past 2 years herself. He doesn't need to speak, she said, not on anyone else's schedule. Another silence, a longer one. Will you come to Caldervane? The Duke said. It was not quite a question and not quite a command. It occupied the space between them, with the weight of something that mattered more than he was making it sound. Wren thought of Fortin House, the ledgers she had ordered from Chaos, the servants who were kind to her, and the lady of the house who was not, the window in the servants' hall, where the light was good in the morning, which was the best thing she could say about the past 14 months. She thought of Wells, and her father's study, and the way numbers had been a language they shared, the one thing that had survived him intact. Yes, she said, I will come. They left Fortin House on a Tuesday, in early November, in a cold so dry it made the gravel of the drive sound like breaking glass underfoot. Wren had her carpet bag and a second one she had acquired, and her 2 dresses had become 3, because she had permitted herself that much practicality in the weeks since Bristol, and she stood in the cold while the Duke's carriage was readied and did not look back at the house. Edmund was already in the carriage. She had not seen him again since the corridor, and she half expected that the openness of that moment, the slight crack in the door of his silence, might have closed again in the interval. Children retreated. It was one of the things grief taught them early. But when she climbed into the carriage and settled onto the opposite bench, Edmund looked at her with those careful gray eyes, and after a long, measuring moment, he said, You said the accounts were boring today. His voice was small and precise, and had the particular quality of a sound that has not been used for a while, a little rusty, a little uncertain of its own edges, as though he were trying a door he wasn't sure would hold his weight. Wren said, Yes, they were the worst kind, no puzzles at all. Edmund was quiet for another moment. Then he said, What kind of puzzles? And that was how it began. It was 11 days to Caldervane by the Duke's route. He stopped twice on business, once in York and once at a smaller estate in County Durham that he referred to only as a matter that wants settling. And in those 11 days, Wren learned the following things. Edmund spoke to her for the first time on the second day of travel, in the carriage, asking about the missing numbers in puzzles. She learned that he had, in fact, spoken very little to anyone since his mother died, which had been 2 years ago, which was the same span as Wren's silence about her father, though she did not point this out to him. She learned that he was interested in maps with the same intensity some children reserve for horses or sweets, and that he had opinions about the accuracy of various county atlases that were considered and detailed and occasionally correct. She learned that he was not, as she had initially assumed, shy. He was cautious. These were different things. Shyness was about the self. Caution was about the world. Wren was intimately familiar with the latter. She learned that the Duke of Caldervane, Lucian, whose name she did not use aloud because one did not, but which she had begun to use internally, because the alternative was the Duke, for every waking thought, and that grew unwieldy, was present in the carriage for several hours of each traveling day. He read. He worked. He signed papers his solicitor had sent ahead to York, and reviewed them with the focused silence of a man for whom working was not a separate state from existing. He was aware of Edmund in the particular way of a father who has learned to hold awareness at a remove, not distance exactly, but the protective stillness of a man who does not know how to approach the wound and is afraid of deepening it by trying. She watched Edmund watch his father. She watched his father not quite watch his son. She thought, this is the actual work. The accounts are the simple part. Caldervane was large. She had known it would be large, intellectually, because a duke's seat in Northumberland, that employed a full household staff and required a formal accounts administrator was unlikely to be modest. But knowing a thing and arriving at it in the late afternoon light of November were different experiences. The house emerged from the landscape the way things do when they have been part of it long enough. Not imposing exactly, but inseparable, as though the moors and the stone had reached some agreement over the centuries about how to coexist. It was pale gray stone. It had more windows than any single building needed. The drive was long, the grass on either side wet and dark green, and above the main door there was a carved heraldic device that Wren catalogued briefly and then looked away from, because Edmund had pointed out the window and said, "That's the long gallery. Father has maps in there." "Does he?" Wren said. "Some of them are wrong," Edmund said, with a mild, authoritative air that was, she realized, a very precise imitation of his father. Inside the house, the assembled staff waited in the entrance hall. They had the particular posture of people who have been told something is happening and have organized themselves accordingly. The housekeeper at Caldervane was a Mrs. Holt, formidable, broad-shouldered, with the face of a woman who considered trust to be a thing earned across years and could not be hurried. She looked at Wren with an assessment that was thorough and not unkind and said, "Miss Ashby." His Grace indicated you would require the room in the east wing overlooking the garden. "Thank you," Wren said. "The accounts office is through the door at the end of the east corridor. It was used by Mr. Finch. He is not with us anymore." A pause. He was not precise. "I see," Wren said. "I expect you will be," Mrs. Holt said, in the tone of a woman who was making herself a small, private wager. The accounts office was a disaster. Not a dramatic disaster. It was not the worst she had seen. But it was the disaster of a man who had understood his own system too well to document it, which meant that when Mr. Finch had left, his system had left with him, and what remained was 6 years of Caldervane's financial records organized according to a private logic that was no longer available. Wren sat in the accounts office on her first full morning at Caldervane, with a candle and a cup of tea that had gone cold, and began, methodically, to find the shape of the thing. She worked for 4 days without emerging from the accounts office before noon. On the second day, Edmund appeared in the doorway, not the full opening of the door, just the edge of it, just his face, and watched her work for a while. She narrated what she was doing, as she had in the corridor at Fortin House, without making it into an invitation he was required to accept. On the third day he came in and sat in the chair in the corner and looked at the maps on the wall, which were outdated by at least 15 years, and which he corrected, quietly, from memory. On the fourth day he asked her what a ledger was for, and she told him, and he said, "It's for keeping track of what was promised," and she looked at him for a moment, and said, "Yes." Exactly that. The Duke came to the accounts office on the morning of the 5th day. He stood in the doorway in the way that was, she was beginning to understand, his habitual mode of entering a room, taking the measure of it before committing to it. He looked at the ordered stacks of papers, the cross-referenced receipts, the new system of labeling she had introduced in red ink because Mr. Finch's black ink was indistinguishable from the original entries. He said, "You've categorized by recipient rather than by date." "By recipient and by type of obligation," Wren said. "Dates are secondary. The most important question is what is owed to whom, and for how long. The date tells you how long ago the promise was made. The recipient tells you whether the promise has been honored." He looked at her, the particular quality of his attention. She had had 5 days to observe it, and she was no longer unnerved by it, though she remained aware of it, was that it had no performance in it. He was simply paying attention, fully, as though this were a sufficient thing to be doing. "Edmund has been in here," he said. "Yes, every afternoon." She set down the receipt she was holding. "He is very good at sitting quietly, while someone else works. That is a rarer skill than people credit." "He spoke to you. He has opinions about maps," Wren said. "The one on the north wall is particularly inaccurate in the border counties, apparently." Something moved in the Duke's face. He looked at the map. He looked at Wren. He said, "He has not. In the evenings, I hear him from the corridor sometimes, talking." A pause. I did not know who he was talking to. "To me. Wren said. He shows me the atlases after supper. He is, I think, testing a theory he has about where the surveys went wrong. Lucian looked at his son's chair in the corner, the small hollow shape the cushion had taken from 4 days of sitting. His jaw held that particular tension she had catalogued in the entrance hall at Fortin House. Not anger. The restraint of a man who was feeling something he had not expected to feel in this room, at this moment, and was deciding what to do with it. He said, "Miss Ashby." "Yes." "What did you say to him?" "In the corridor at Fortin House." "I told him the accounts were boring that day," she said, "and that the interesting days are when the numbers don't match, and you have to find out why." The Duke was quiet for a long moment. "That was all?" "I didn't ask him to speak," Wren said. "I just talked. About something ordinary. I thought he might be more comfortable if there was no requirement attached to it." Lucian looked at her with an expression she could not categorize. It was not the assessing look of their first meeting, and it was not the removed professionalism of a man reviewing an employee's competence. It was something more unguarded than either of those things, and it lasted only a moment before his face reorganized itself. "The summer accounts," he said. "When you have finished the reconstruction of Finch's system, I will need a summary for the estate board in January." "I will have it done by the 3rd week of December," Wren said. "You are certain of the timeline?" "I am certain of the timeline," she said. He left. She went back to the receipts. It was 3 weeks before Christmas when the letter arrived. It came in the ordinary morning post, which Wren sorted alongside the household correspondence as a matter of habit. She had agreed with Mrs. Holt that any correspondence pertaining to the estate's accounts would come to her directly, rather than waiting for the Duke to forward it, which was more efficient and had saved approximately 4 days of confusion in the first 2 weeks. She sorted it, and then she found, at the bottom of the pile, a letter addressed not to the Duke of Caldervane, but to the accounts administrator, in a hand she recognized. It was from Lady Fortin's solicitor. The letter stated, with the circumlocutions of a man who had been told to communicate something unpleasant and was doing his best to make it less so, that in the process of reviewing the Fortin estate documents in preparation for the Eastern parcel sale, certain irregularities had been discovered in the household accounts for the period prior to Wren's appointment. The irregularities, he wrote, had initially been attributed to the previous accounts keeper's method. However, upon closer examination, they appeared to indicate a systematic pattern of reassignment. Funds designated for household wages redirected to a private account held in Lady Fortin's name at a Cheltenham banking house. The letter asked whether Wren had any documentation that might clarify the extent of the discrepancy. It asked this, she noticed, with the particular care of a man who already knew the answer and was hoping to have it confirmed without being the one to say it first. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she went to the file she had rebuilt from the Fortin records. She had brought copies, as a matter of professional habit, because ledgers that no one else has seen should never be entirely unreproduced, and she found what she had found in those first few weeks at Fortin House, and had not yet brought to anyone's attention, because the timing had never been right, and because she had not been certain whose business it was. It was now clearly someone's business. She wrote back to the solicitor that afternoon with a clear, itemized account of the discrepancies she had noted, the dates on which the redirections appeared to have begun, and the approximate total she had calculated, which was £940 over 4 years. She cited the specific receipt references. She kept her language plain and precise. She signed it Miss W. Ashby, Accounts Administrator, Caldervane Estate, and she sent it by the next morning post. She told the Duke that evening. She found him in the library. It was his habit in the evenings, after Edmund had gone to bed, to spend an hour there before retiring, and knocked at the open door and said, "I have something to tell you that concerns the Fortin estate transaction." He looked up from his papers. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. She told him. She told him. All of it. What she had found in the first weeks at Fortin House. What she had suspected but not been able to prove. What the solicitor's letter had indicated, and what she had sent in reply. She told it in order, plainly, without editorializing, and he listened without interrupting, which was one of his habits she had come to appreciate, in the way you appreciate things that turn out to be rare. When she finished, he said, "You found this in the first weeks." I suspected it. I was not certain until I had the full scope of the records. "Why did you not bring it to Lady Fortin?" "Because Lady Fortin," Wren said, "was the one doing it." A pause. "You knew that?" "I suspected it," she said again. "I had no proof that would have survived a direct accusation. I had anomalies and an uncomfortable pattern. Those are sufficient for my own understanding, but they are not sufficient for accusing a woman in her own house of defrauding her own household staff." He looked at her. "And after you came here?" "I was waiting," she said, "for the moment when it became someone else's formal matter rather than mine alone. The sale triggered that moment. Yes, the solicitor reviewing the full records found what I found. He is now the one asking the question. I have simply provided the documentation." Another long silence. The fire in the library made the room smell of wood smoke and old leather and the faint remains of brandy from earlier in the evening. Wren sat with her hands in her lap and waited. "You took a copy of the Fortin records," he said. "I take copies of everything," Wren said. "It is the only way to ensure that what actually happened can be distinguished from what someone would prefer to have happened." Lucian looked at her for a long moment. His face had that quality again, the unguarded thing she had seen in the accounts office, the thing she could not quite name. He said, "That is either a very cautious habit or a very particular one." "My father taught me," she said, "that a number written down is a promise, and that promises should be witnessed." He said, "Your father sounds like a man worth knowing." It was the plainest thing he had said to her in the 6 weeks since Fortin House, and it landed with a weight that surprised her, not painfully, but completely, the way a thing settles when it has found the exact right place. She said, "He was." The matter of Lady Fortin resolved itself over the following 3 weeks, in the manner such things do when documentation is thorough and the relevant solicitors are in possession of all the salient facts, first with legal correspondence, then with private negotiation, and finally with an agreement by which Lady Fortin would repay the redirected funds from the proceeds of the Eastern parcel sale, and the matter would not proceed further. There was no trial, there was no public scene, there was only the transfer of funds and a formal letter to all relevant parties confirming the resolution. Wren received a copy of the final confirmation on a Wednesday morning in mid-December, the same morning she completed the reconstruction of Caldervane's accounts. She placed the confirmation in its file. She picked up the estate summary for January and read through it one final time, checking for errors she knew were not there, but checked for anyway, as a matter of professional faith. Then she laid it on the desk and allowed herself, for the first time in some weeks, to sit quietly and breathe. Edmund found her like that when he came after lessons. He came in, sat in his corner chair, opened his atlas, and then looked at her over the top of it and said, "Are the accounts interesting today?" "They are finished today," she said. "That is the best kind of day." He considered this. Better than puzzle days? "Different," she said. "A puzzle day is interesting while it's happening. A finished day is satisfying. It means all the promises have been accounted for." Edmund nodded slowly, with the gravity of a 7-year-old who has decided this is correct. Then he said, "Father says you are staying." Wren looked at him. "Did he say that to you?" "He said it to Mrs. Holt." Edmund turned a page in his atlas. "I was in the corridor." Wren thought about this. She did not know how to feel about a duke telling his housekeeper she was staying, rather than telling her herself. She thought she probably had something to say about that. She found him that evening. Same library, same hour after supper, same wood smoke and leather quality to the air. The fire lower now because December was drawing on, and they had both developed the habit of letting it burn down toward the end of the evening without adding more coal. She stood in the doorway. She said, "Edmund tells me you told Mrs. Holt I am staying." He looked up. He set down the paper he was reading. He said, "I should have told you directly." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He held her gaze. He did not look away. "Will you stay?" "That depends," she said, "on what you mean by staying." A pause. He waited. "If it means I continue as I have been," she said, "with full authority over the accounts within agreed limits and independent standing in this household, then yes, I will stay as long as the work is mine to do properly." She took a breath. But if it means I am here as a kindness, as something arranged for Edmund's benefit, or because the situation at Fortin House was convenient, then that is a different arrangement, and I would rather know it plainly. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted. Somewhere in the upper part of the house, a door clicked shut, Edmund being seen to bed by the nurse, probably. Wren stood in the doorway and did not move. When I came to Fortin House, Lucian said slowly, I came because I had bought the debt. It was a financial decision, a straightforward one. A pause. The woman arguing quietly with Lady Fortin about the presentation of accounts was not part of what I had planned for the morning. I see, Wren said. I noticed, he said, the precision, the refusal to be redirected when she tried to dismiss you. He paused. I also noticed that you spoke to Edmund in the corridor as though he was a person whose attention was worth having for its own sake. Not a problem, not a symptom, a person. She said, he is a person. Yes, his voice was quiet. He is, and he has been, unreachable, to me, for 2 years. I did not know how to. He stopped. He started again. I am not a man who is accustomed to being unable to address a problem directly. Edmund is not a problem, she said gently. No, he said, he is not. He looked at her steadily. You are not here as a kindness, Miss Ashby. You are here because you are the most competent person I have put in that accounts office in 6 years, and because my son talked to you in the first corridor before I had finished reviewing my own solicitor's papers, and because I find, increasingly, that I am interested in what you think about things. He paused. About everything, if I am entirely honest. Wren considered this. She looked at the man in the wing chair, the stillness of him, the effort it had cost him to say that much, the jaw that held things without releasing them, and she thought of 14 months of ledgers at Fortin House, and the solicitor in Bristol, and her father's study in Wells, and the small, pale boy in the corridor doorway who had risked the first word after 2 years of silence on a woman who had done nothing more than say the accounts were boring. She thought, it is not rescue if you choose to come in from the cold yourself. She stepped into the library. She sat in the chair across from him, as she had done when she told him about the Fortin accounts. She said, I have a condition. His eyes did not waver. Name it. If I stay, she said, and if this becomes something other than a professional arrangement, I need it to be a partnership, not charity, not arrangement, not a duke taking pity on a woman with a carpetbag. She held his gaze. I have been managed and accommodated and redirected by people who meant it kindly. I do not want that. I want what my parents had, which was 2 people who each kept their own accounting of the world and trusted the other one to do the same. He looked at her for a long, still moment. The fire was very low. The room was warm and smelled of wood smoke, and the faint trace of the ink she still sometimes carried on her fingers no matter how carefully she wiped her hands. He said, Your father kept accounts. Your mother kept the house, Wren said, and kept him honest about which numbers were wishes rather than facts. She paused. She was not shy about it. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the structural precursor to one, the place where a smile lives in a face before it has decided to arrive. It was the first time she had seen it, and it changed his face considerably. It made him look like a man who had, somewhere underneath the pewter stillness, a capacity for something very warm. He said, Then we have an understanding. We have the beginning of one, Wren said. The rest wants time. He reached across the space between them. He laid his hand over hers, on the arm of the chair. Just that, just his hand over hers, steady and deliberate, the way he did everything. She felt the warmth of it through her sleeve. She did not move away. Edmund will be unbearable in the long gallery tomorrow, he said. He wants to show you the border county maps. He has apparently been preparing a case. I look forward to it, she said. Outside the library windows, Northumberland was very dark and very cold, and the moors were a sound rather than a sight at this hour. A low, steady exhalation of wind across distance, the kind of sound a landscape makes when it has nothing to prove. Inside the room, the fire had burned to copper, and the quiet was the kind that has been earned rather than imposed. You may know this feeling. If you have ever been a person who kept careful track of what was owed and what was promised, and found yourself, at last, somewhere that the accounting was safe to put down. Not finished, not closed, simply held, for once, by someone who understood what it cost to carry it. That was Caldervane in the end. Not a rescue, a reckoning, the kind that comes out right.